Since 1933, German Jews had been excluded from all professions, robbed of their worldly goods, and forbidden to marry non-Jews. But that was not enough. Nazi Germany wanted to get rid of all its Jews. Over the last 5 years, tens of thousands of them had already left, but the aim was to expel them all. Total war against them now began, and Himmler had all the powers necessary to execute it.
National Socialism is a type of cancerous growth that is purely German. Do not despair, it is I who is German. The others aren't Germans. It's the spirit that matters, not the blood. And always this fear of the Gestapo, the fear that all I write will lead me to the concentration camps.
The Nazis already controlled the whole of German society. There were already concentration camps for non-Jews. Dachau had been there since 1933. A whole network of camps was being developed.
Eliminating civil rights, civil liberties, and any possibility of moral restraint.
The truth is, there weren't many people left to protest. The Social Democrats were in the concentration camps. The Communists had been thrown out. Who could oppose them?
The first stage in German policy was one of segregation within Germany, and then a second phase, which began in 1938, was a policy of expulsion. They began trying to push out foreign Jews.
They gave the order to round up the Polish Jews in Germany and run them to the Polish frontier, which they did in October of 1938. The Polish government closed the frontier, and these people were caught in no man's land. One of the families that was caught in no man's land was the Greenspan family. And their son, living in Paris, Herschel Greenspan, heard about his parents stranded in this no man's land camp, and that's when he got a pistol and went into the embassy in Paris and shot von Rath, and that, of course, triggered the Kristallnacht.
Goebbels says in his diaries they were going to the meeting in Munich that night on the 9th of November 1938. And already they got the news that von Rath, the legation secretary, the German legation secretary in Paris, had been shot by this young Jew, Hermann Greenspan.
Goebbels reacted violently to Greenspan's arrest. He saw it as the perfect pretext for action.
Unusually, Hitler left the meeting without giving a speech, simply saying, just leave it to the paramilitaries. This so-called spontaneous explosion of anger from the people was designed to terrorize the Jewish population and force them to leave Germany.
And Goebbels said to Hitler on the way to this, effectively, should we let the demonstrations, i.e. the pogroms, run? They were already starting locally up and down the place. And Hitler gave his agreement to that. I said, yes, let the demonstrations continue.
I went back to our apartment, and there was broken glass everywhere. And that's the first time I heard the phrase, Kristallnacht. The first time I heard it.
In the cities, a lot of people saw what happened. They were woken up in the night by the noise of breaking windows and fires.
Hundreds of synagogues were sacked, pillaged, or burnt. The firemen were ordered to let them burn. Jewish cemeteries were profaned. This pogrom was particularly violent in Berlin and Vienna, which had the largest Jewish populations. In despair at the violence and the destruction of their homes, many Jews, sometimes entire families, took their own lives.
When he was 12, my father saw all the damage from the November pogrom in our little town. He lived out of town, but he went in the next day with his friends to see what had gone on. A lot of people did. Hardly anybody said anything. Some of them were happy about it and glad that violence had broken out against the Jews. Some of them even took part in it. Other people were horrified and ashamed.
Nobody protested, nobody intervened, and there was very little real help.
In the little villages, they didn't ask the locals to loot and burn the synagogues. They brought in people from the next village. They got them drunk to do it. They weren't sure anyone would do that to their own neighbors.
Jewish men aged 16 to 60 were arrested and 7,000 Jewish stores were looted and burned and ransacked.
And that, of course, then led to the arrest of around 20 to 30,000 Jews and their internment for short periods, but horrific periods, in concentration camps.
My father went missing. They'd sent him to Dachau. I don't know. He never spoke about it. Never mentioned it. He was there for a week, but he never told us what happened.
A well-known Catholic priest at St. Edwidge Cathedral in Berlin, Bishop Lichtenberg, spoke up and said, "The synagogue in flames near our cathedral is also the house of God." Kristallnacht caused a certain indignation in Germany, not because they liked the Jews, but mainly because it was a shock to the German sense of social order.
When there was so much destruction in Germany, of course, the Jews were not responsible for that, but Goering used that as a way, so to speak, to compensate for the effects of the Reich Kristallnacht pogrom with the imposition of the punitive tax. That's a tax on every Jew as a response against the Jews, but he still made the Jews pay for the damage.
Part of Kristallnacht is to make clear to German Jews that they have absolutely no future in Germany. How do you put even more pressure on Jews to force them to leave?
The anti-Jewish atmosphere in Germany was very strong. Speaking of the day of reckoning will come, and we were waiting for the showdown with the Jews, and all sorts of fairly horrible threats are coming about then.
You had to create greater pressure on German Jews, make them more desperate.
The Der Stürmer newspaper was particularly virulent with its anti-Jewish propaganda. All the old cliches were there in its cartoons, on every page. It was really the most abject anti-Semitism of the most degrading kind.
This journal, published by Julius Streicher in Nuremberg, is an abominable sewer of the worst kind of anti-Semitic cliches. Jews eating and sacrificing children, trafficking white slaves, lustful, rapists, thieves, all the cliches are there.
The Jews are the enemy, the Jews are dangerous, the Jews can appear in any way, they disguise themselves, they're very cunning.
Dem deutschen Volke wird der Vorwurf gemacht, es habe den Antisemitismus, den Kampf gegen die Juden in die Welt gebracht und sei deshalb ein barbarisches Volk. Wer dies behauptet, sagt die Unwahrheit. Schon vor Jahrtausenden waren nicht-jüdische Völker gezwungen, sich gegen jüdische Eindringlinge zu wehren.
The November pogrom was a decisive step, but at the time the decision still hadn't been taken to exterminate the Jews.
There was a meeting on the 12th of November, 2 days after Kristallnacht. A very important meeting, certainly the most important meeting ever held about the Jewish question. Apart from Hitler, the whole elite of the Third Reich was there. Goering, Goebbels, and of course Heydrich, who represented the SS. And that's where we hear Goering say, "But we can't let the Jews starve." And Heydrich replies, "We'll have to decide whether we want this or not." Goering couldn't yet imagine leaving the Jews to die, but Heydrich said, "It's a decision we'll have to take."
It is a fundamental turning point in the fate of the Jews in the Third Reich. The SS, Heydrich, will be in charge of solving the Jewish question, getting rid of the Jews through emigration, forced emigration, expulsion, and later on mass murder.
After the November pogrom, there was a surge in anti-Semitic politics in Germany. Most of all, Jewish finances were attacked. Civil servants, doctors, and lawyers were all subject to bans. The young university-educated technocrats and administrators in all fields, statisticians, urban planners, geographers, historians, were calculating the advantages for themselves of the Jews being eliminated.
Germany is now at full employment. Many businesses want to expand. And Goering passed decrees a law that Jews must register all of their property. He has an inventory of everything they own. And there's a process of passing one decree after another, forcing Jews out of certain spheres of the economy, is already underway.
The goal was still for the Jews to be deported as quickly as possible, or to emigrate. It was still possible to emigrate at that point, and that's what the powers that be wanted, even though on the other hand, they were making it difficult by confiscating people's property.
The vast majority of the population now were increasingly sympathetic to the notion that Jews, as lawyers and doctors, should leave Germany.
Ich sage, dass das Judentum nicht etwa rücksichtslos ausgerottet wurde, beweist die Tatsache, dass zum Beispiel in Berlin noch immer fast 50% Nicht-Arier zur ärztlichen Kassenpraxis zugelassen sind.
In some professions, such as doctors, people tried to denounce their colleagues. Houses and apartments became available.
They say whole university departments were emptied in one fell swoop. Suddenly, half your colleagues were gone. Didn't you notice? You didn't notice they weren't there anymore? How could people be so indifferent about them just disappearing from one day to another?
Nobody spoke up and said it was scandalous and shameful what was happening. Even 100 people would have been admirable. But there wasn't a single one. And that's astonishing.
Many of these discriminatory measures were put into practice after the November pogrom. They weren't allowed to sit on public benches or go to the swimming pool.
One strategy was labeling people, marking them with a yellow star. Another form of labeling was the 1938 decree that required all Jews in the Reich to add the name Israel or Sarah to their first names, because the Nazis believed that Jews were concealing themselves and trying to hide. So from January 1939, you'd have to call yourself Friedrich Israel, for example.
Jews could no longer go to libraries or eat in restaurants that were for non-Jews.
And above all, there was the hate you felt in the street. There was a big sign up in the school. Jews no longer accepted or admitted. You had to leave immediately. The teachers came in and said, "Goodbye, thank you, that's it." And there you were. We left the school like, I don't know, like we had the plague.
And so after Kristallnacht, after the Night of Broken Glass, there was a new effort by the Roosevelt administration to persuade Western Hemisphere countries to take in more persecuted people.
This change of policy is partly the result of popular outrage, horror about what is happening in Vienna, in Berlin. Even the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who did not like Jews, even Chamberlain is upset by burning synagogues.
Some 10,000 Jewish children were sent and taken to England and left their parents and so on. They didn't understand the full ramifications, that they'd never see their parents again.
The British government allowed unaccompanied children into the country on ordinary tourist visas. A few very young children, accompanied by other older children, were included in the program. Private individuals or organizations had to undertake to provide for them and their education, and to arrange for them to leave Great Britain at a later date. Parents were not allowed to accompany their children. The first group arrived in Britain in December 1938.
But it wasn't enough. There were never enough places of refuge for Jews around the world. The struggle of Jews to leave Germany and Austria is ferocious. Jews are looking for anywhere to go in the world. Now, the Germans do not stop that.
How can you leave if you have no passport, no nationality? We no longer had German nationality and no money. How could we ever emigrate?
From the November pogrom till the end of that year, Jewish traders all had their licenses revoked, which meant that from the start of 1939, there were no more Jewish businesses. The Jews had their livelihoods taken from them.
The Jews were already a pariah group on the fringes of society, disliked by many, demonized by the regime, and there was no, put it in a very crude sense, there was no political mileage to be gained by standing up for the Jews.
Sie sollen sich hüten. Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestopft werden.
And also at that point, the Jews are lost. The Jews are completely surrounded by a population that feels no common ties to them.
There was some resistance, but in general, nothing much was really done.
Jews understand that the Nazis have turned a corner in their policy. There is no future for any Jews, the old, the young, none. They are not wanted in the Reich anymore, and they will be subject to the most harsh discrimination and violence beyond the law. They are now fair game, an easy target. Anyone can attack the Jews.
They weren't stupid. They had been there for 6 years in 1939, still, but some decided to go, others stayed. The majority left of German Jews.
In the end, over half the Jews of Germany and Austria left the country.
Quarter stayed, okay, and didn't leave, even when they had seen synagogues burning throughout Germany and Kristallnacht and so on.
The tragedy of the period from November 1938 is that Jews were allowed to leave the Reich. German Austrian Jews could leave if they had money, if they had immigration papers, if they had a place to go, they could go. The Germans would not stop them.
But by 1939, in the fall, it became almost impossible to leave. Up to then, you could leave.
When Hitler begins the planning for war, the situation for the Jews in Germany changes very badly. It changes very badly because they are an enemy within.
But then we come to this speech on the 30th of January 1939, where Hitler then gives this, what became his, always referred to as his prophecy.
Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
For Hitler, the ultimate goal is to restore Germany as a superpower in the world. And to do that, he believes he needs a large empire. Britain had an empire, France had an empire, Russia had a large area, and that the destiny of Germany, where is it going to get its territory so that it can grow its population and expand, would be in Eastern Europe. And then Hitler turns, and before he can attack the Soviet Union, he has to take care of Poland.
My great-uncle, Shmuel, was desperately begging all of his relatives in America for some help, trying to get papers, trying to get money so that they could leave Poland. But you couldn't get a Jew out of Poland in 1939. The queue for affidavits was already 3 years long. He wasn't getting away from Hitler, he was getting away from Poland. Poland was the bad place. The world situation at that point was clearly one in which there was going to be a war, and this man was trapped. And he knew that he was trapped, and he was trapped.
In August 1939, it already looked like there would be a war. The Germans had already occupied Czechoslovakia, and they'd already issued an ultimatum to Poland. In Warsaw, they'd started digging trenches to shelter in if they were bombarded. And on the morning of the 1st of September, we were woken up by the bombs falling. They told us Germany had attacked Poland.
With no declaration of war, the German army invaded Poland. German troops, supported by more than 2,000 armored vehicles and over 1,000 planes, broke through Polish defenses and advanced on Warsaw. Over the following few weeks, the Polish army was defeated. By the 28th of September, the whole of Poland was occupied. Hitler and Stalin helped themselves to all the lands that lay between their two countries. The first troops headed into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Poland was broken up, with the east going to the USSR and the west to Germany. Great Britain and France, who the previous spring had undertaken to defend Poland's territorial integrity, declared war on Germany.
Poland is divided in half between Stalin and Hitler. The partition treaty that accompanies the non-aggression pact, Stalin is able to take over Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Bessarabian portion of Romania, and the eastern half of Poland.
With the new annexation of Poland, 60% of its Jews were living in the zone annexed by Nazi Germany, and 40% in what was now Soviet territory.
So that a large number of Polish Jews are going immediately into the Soviet sphere. Some to 200 to 300,000 further Jews from Western Poland, from the Nazi sphere, flee eastward and cross the demarcation line and cross into the territory that the Red Army occupies as opposed to the Nazi Army.
20 лет трудящиеся Западной Белоруссии ждали этот день. Они знали, что советский народ спасет их от гнета. 17 сентября 1939 года навсегда будет для них великим праздником.
part of the crazy equation here is that the Jews are identified with the Bolsheviks, are seen as the ones who had the least objection to the Red Army coming in. The Red Army isn't out to kill Jews. The Nazi army is. So of course the Jews in these areas greeted the Red Army as protectors. It was going to preserve them from the arrival of the Nazis. They're very glad that the Red Army is there instead of the Germans.
So the word got out, and it already established itself during the war itself, that Jews are being favored by the Soviets, and then they also are collaborating with the Soviets.
This is viewed as treason. This is viewed as greeting the foreign conqueror and confirming the Jews are all communists.
What happens in Poland is a big step up from what was going on in Germany, and that now gives the Germans effectively free hand, free of any legal constraints to do what they want with the Jews in Poland.
The Germans use propaganda every day to turn people against the Jews.
When the German army marches into Poland, this is in a sense, opens the door for local anti-Semites to take violence against Jews.
Although German persecution was directed at them just as much as at the Jews, the Poles showed no solidarity at all with the Jews. On the contrary, it merely reinforced their anti-Semitism.
Relations between Jews and Christians in Poland was never very good. For 100 years, before the Second World War, there had been tension, and there was occasional violence.
Trzeba powiedzieć, że w Polsce antysemityzm. There was a long tradition of anti-Semitism in Poland. Trzeba o tym pamiętać, że there had already been frequent pogroms.
They're burning the businesses of Jewish business owners. They have these terrible taxes on them. Even before the war began, there was in Poland a terrible environment for the Jews.
Always the same story. Jews, get out.
There was very strong anti-Semitic feeling. Jews represented 10% of the population. Out of 33 million inhabitants, over 3 million were Jewish.
Some are in the large cities, Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow, Lublin. But there are also many medium-sized towns in Poland with large Jewish populations, and small towns which may be 50, 60, 70% Jewish in population.
Jews had lived there for hundreds, in fact, about 1,000 years in Poland, and Jews who had been assimilated. There were lawyers, doctors, and members of the intelligentsia. But very many were sort of itinerant merchants who would carry their stuff with them and just go from one village to another, trying to sell a few things, and then would come back home for Shabbos. And Jews could not own land, so they were merchants, but very poor. But this would not prevent, of course, a kind of local people from identifying Jews as rich.
For centuries, life for the Polish Jews had been governed by decisions made by the regime of the day that had either welcomed them, encouraged them to settle and protected them, or else oppressed and persecuted them. From 1937, university quotas reduced the number of Jews admitted. The Polish doctors and lawyers' unions would now only accept Christians. The majority of Jews led lives separate to the Polish population. Jewish standards of living suffered from economic boycotts and attacks on their property, to the point where they became one of the most impoverished Jewish communities in the world.
The Germans find themselves in control of 1.5 million Jews. And these are not Jews like the Jews of Germany.
Jews in Germany were very assimilated, but in the East, it was immediately visible who is Jewish and who isn't, by their hairstyle, by the clothing they wear, by the language they speak.
In anti-Semitic propaganda, Jews were described according to stereotypes of the Jews you would find in Poland, but hardly ever in Germany. They suddenly discovered there really were Jews like the ones described in the propaganda.
These are Ostjuden, the kind of Jews that Hitler and the Nazis hated most of all. They are Orthodox Jews with capotas and payos. They looked to the Nazis. They looked revolting, disgusting.
And so for some Germans as well, these initial weeks after they invade Poland, there are many of what I would call rituals of humiliation or rituals of violence, in which they will grab Jews off the street and cut their beards, that no one attempts to stop. I mean, it's if anything, some people are encouraging them.
From the moment they arrived in Poland, the task of the German troops was to terrorize the Jewish population. The campaign of hate and violence would force the Jews to flee the areas that were to be part of the Reich and drive them into the Soviet-occupied zone. In just a few days, Wehrmacht and Einsatzgruppen units would murder 600 Jews. Orthodox Jews were the prime targets. In addition to their favorite entertainment, the beard game, where they would cut, burn, or pull out Jews' beards, often tearing chunks out of their cheeks, the Nazis enjoyed making these Orthodox Jews jump, dance, and sing at the bonfires on which their sacred books were being burned. They whipped them, forced them to eat pork, and carved stars of David on their foreheads. One soldier wrote in his diary, "The people living here are beasts in human form, with their beards and caftans and their devilish, grotesque faces. They disgust me. If you weren't a sworn enemy of the Jews, you become one here."
A lot of Jews fled at the very last few months of 1939, and they brought information about the atrocities which started almost immediately under German occupation, and people had family across the border. Some messages did get across, but the problem was that the Soviet authorities didn't spread this information, and to some extent even counteracted it because they were afraid of provoking a war with Germany.
After the German conquest of Poland, Germans have to develop some kind of policy for the Poles and also for the Jews. But it's remarkable that they have no policy for either. Hitler does not know what he's going to do with conquered Poland. Finally, they decide that parts of Poland will be annexed to the Reich, and the rest will be made a sort of a colony under Hans Frank.
And he runs the general government the way colonial governors of all the European empires ran their colonies overseas.
In October 1939, Hans Frank was appointed governor of occupied Poland. He answered directly to Hitler. He was, in fact, his lawyer, then a minister. Hans Frank had three main objectives: the elimination of the Polish elite, the economic pillaging of the country for Germany's gain, and the deportation of Jews.
Hans Frank was a fanatical Nazi, absolutely ruthless, one might even say barbaric. Hans Frank lived on the Wawel in Krakow, in his castle, like some kind of feudal lord, a despot ruling over a kingdom in which Jews were like flies who he could crush when he wanted to.
Diese krummnasigen Raubpiraten, diese Sendboten der Vernichtung, diese Elendswichte und Nachtgaukler, dieses verdammte Misch- und Börsengesindel, das geht nun einmal nicht. Der Deutsche mag den Juden nicht, der Jude den Deutschen nicht, infolgedessen muss der Jude weg.
The army basically gives up the military administration of these territories, and it is turned over to a civil administration. But the SS has a very strong position in Poland as well.
The SS created task forces, Einsatzgruppen, and they had specific instructions to eliminate members of the Polish intelligentsia and also to eliminate certain Jews.
Heydrich reminded them that their objective was both short-term and long-term security. And that's when the specific orders were given to automatically execute certain parts of the population. They started shooting people on a fairly massive scale. 12,000 people were executed.
Horrendous terror mechanisms of terror developed in Poland, which far greater than anything that existed in Germany between 1933 and 1939.
They killed several hundred people to scare the populations of the cities.
The Germans decapitate Polish society. They destroy much of the liberal intelligentsia.
and destroyed elites in all walks of life. There were lawyers, doctors, engineers. This was really a substantial part of intellectual, of human capital of Poland that was destroyed, you know, and for Poland it was a disaster.
The parts that were incorporated into the Reich were going to be cleansed of Poles and also Jews. This was a massive program of ethnic cleansing.
The south of Poland was to be the first territory occupied by the Germans. So they had to move all the Poles and all the Jews out of there in order to install Germans in their place.
So the Nazis began a huge program of eviction.
Braune Schwestern betreuen die Volksdeutschen. Fast 20 Jahre mussten diese armen Menschen in lichtlosen, unhygienischen Kellern wohnen. Unzählige volksdeutsche Familien wurden durch die polnischen Behörden der Verelendung preisgegeben. Verlassene Wohnungen polnischer und jüdischer Auswanderer werden gesäubert und für Volksdeutsche.
Now, at the same time, Stalin let Hitler understand that the Volksdeutsch could leave. If they didn't want to live under Soviet rule, they could go. The Nazi leadership comes up with a new policy to bring the Volksdeutsch home to the Reich.
Himmler was also responsible for the native-born Germans living outside Germany. There were hundreds of thousands of them, in Ukraine, in the USSR, in Poland.
Over 500,000 ethnic Germans are brought into the Greater Reich.
If you were bringing in ethnic Germans from the Baltic states or the USSR or Romania, you had to install them in occupied territories. You had to expel 4 Jews or Poles.
Eichmann then is sent to the incorporated territory to make it German. They want to ethnically cleanse all the Poles. So he becomes the man in charge of coordinating this massive ethnic cleansing. He's the expert on putting people onto trains and shipping them.
But this is a gigantic project. There were millions of Poles, and it was a hopeless task. Himmler was put in charge. He made a mess of it. He didn't have the resources. There were not enough trains. There were not enough staff to move millions of people.
The Nazis attempted to lead a campaign of mass expulsion of non-Jewish Polish citizens, deporting or imprisoning them to spread panic and crush any attempts at resistance.
They never managed to get rid of enough Poles, and they never managed to settle the Volksdeutsch. But the massive forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of Poles is a training ground. The Nazi leadership, men like Eichmann, learn a great deal about mass movements of people, roundups, processing, entraining people, getting them onto trains, shipping them out, dumping them somewhere else, is a rehearsal for what happens later to the Jews. Poland is a laboratory of the final solution.
So it's a laboratory because the Germans themselves are experimenting with ways then of dealing with the Jews in that period.
There were many killings of Jews, but there is no policy of mass murder of Jews in Poland.
The initial goal for the Germans is that they will chase the Jews away, that they will, what we now call ethnic cleansing. Jews will have to be sent somewhere else.
The first plan that comes out of the head office of the SS is a plan for a Jewish reservation, something like the reservations for the Native American Indians. So the SS develops the idea of a so-called reservation in the area of Lublin. Eichmann begin to deport Jews from Prague, from Ostrava, from Vienna. This is a kind of an experiment.
The first deportation took place under abysmal circumstances. It was incredibly cold. A lot of people died right away. Horrendous experience, and it's just in cattle cars.
It doesn't work out. In fact, it's a failure. It's a disaster. Hans Frank had screamed and shouted and said, "No, I don't want your Jews. Don't send me Jews."
We can't take any more Jews into this area. We're full. We don't know what to do. We can't feed them. We can't house them, and so on. So stop sending us Jews.
Everything was rushed, in a hurry, improvised, and it very often failed. And the question remains, what do you do with 1.5 million Jews in Poland? They have to be contained.
So people were then left with the problem, then were unable to do so. So the blockages built up. Out of the blockages then, big ghettos were established.
There is no other plan. There is no other vision. No one knows what to do with the Jews in Poland. And that is why in Poland they go into ghettos.
They declared that all Jews had to go into the ghettos. We knew that was to be the fate of the Jews under the German regime.
Throughout the whole territory, Jews were gathered together and isolated in defined areas. During the winter of 1939 to 1940, the ghettos were established, just as in medieval times. Access to them was controlled by German forces, and it was impossible to get out. In some places, the Germans built walls to isolate them under the pretext of containing the various diseases the Jews were said to be carrying.
Les Allemands confinent les Juifs dans des ghettos.
The Germans confined the Jews to the ghettos and decided that these ghettos should be run by the Jews themselves.
Someone would be put at the head of the Jewish council, and he'd be the only person they'd negotiate with. He'd carry out his orders and be responsible for all the Jews.
And so that you have this gray zone in the middle of people who, in a sense, are victims but have been incorporated into the machinery of destruction of the perpetrator.
The Jewish community of Łódź was about 230,000 strong. It was the third biggest Jewish diaspora in the world, after New York and Warsaw. They started persecuting the Jews. There were all kinds of interdictions. They had to wear a star.
They told Jews that they had to move into particular places to live, and they pretended this was for health reasons, the claim being that Jews were carriers of typhus and were dangerous to the public health. But it usually was in part to grab houses.
Hans Frank had made Krakow his capital. He now announced his intention to empty the city of its 66,000 Jewish inhabitants. The representatives of the Reich, he added, should have no contact with the Jews as they are leaving, as this might expose them to contagious diseases. The city must be rid of most of these Jews, apart from those workers we still need. Krakow must be cleansed of its Jews. Those who leave voluntarily may take their belongings, apart from any stolen goods. The Jews, thus driven out, settled just outside the city.
The economic life of the Jews was terribly disrupted. If their businesses and their jobs were outside the ghetto, well, they couldn't work and they couldn't earn money.
The Jews started moving into the ghetto, into the worst housing in the whole of Łódź. From one day to the next, 160,000 people found themselves in a place where there were only a few thousand before. There were 15 people to a room. People who'd been living in decent conditions were now in the most dreadful squalor.
A pupil in our class died yesterday of hunger and exhaustion. He was the third. There are people collapsing in the street because there are no more food rations. I'm getting weaker at a terrifying rate. Everything is disappearing before our eyes.
It's only in a few places that there are ghettos with walls. Lodz or Warsaw Ghetto.
Warsaw Ghetto was the largest ghetto in Poland. The largest ghetto in German-occupied Poland, the largest ghetto in all of Europe.
The Jews had been concentrated in a certain part of town, separate from the non-Jewish population.
The Warsaw Ghetto wasn't hermetically sealed like at Łódź. There was contact between the people of the ghetto and those outside. Of course, there were contraband goods in the Warsaw Ghetto. 80% of the food you could find was smuggled in.
People don't have jobs. Their money is taken away from them.
There were already 360,000 people in this ghetto, 1/3 of the population of Warsaw, all living on 5% of its territory.
At the beginning, you also had resources, stuff you had brought in to the ghetto with you that you could sell. You could market on the black market, you could trade, and you therefore were able to get certain food or something else you needed and therefore survive.
Very quickly, Jews began to starve. The death rate among Jews began to rise, particularly in the biggest ghettos, in the ghetto at Łódź and then the ghetto in Warsaw. Some Germans said, starve, fine, let them. Faster the better. Welcoming the attrition of the ghetto population through starvation. And of course, once the population became malnourished, epidemic comes, so it's a combination of starvation and disease. But another group said, these people are a potential labor force that we could use to help, first to earn their own living and eventually to work for the German war economy. And so you had this struggle between people who wanted to create ghetto economies to make the ghetto more self-sufficient and to utilize Jewish labor for the war economy, and those that wanted to leave everything totally chaotic and simply have the Jews starve or perish from disease over a quicker period of time. In most areas, in fact, the people advocating creating ghetto economies prevailed. So you had, in most areas of Poland, gradually the setting up of ghetto economies in which German businessmen and the German military overusing the ghettos for war production.
There were ghettos where the Jews were living in appalling conditions. Others were better off and could work and feed themselves. If it weren't for the yellow stars on their coats and the press of the crowd, one would never know that these apparently healthy, well-dressed men and women were filmed in the Bedzin ghetto in Silesia, even though the film itself was obvious propaganda. The German in charge of the ghetto, Alfred Rösner, was neither a Nazi Party member nor SS. He was appointed to Bedzin soon after the invasion of Poland. In this region, with an 80% Jewish population, he ran the leading textiles workshops. Thousands of workers would work under the direct control of the SS, making uniforms for the Wehrmacht. Rösner was notable for his humanity. Of the 30,000 inhabitants of the Bedzin ghetto, 2,000 would survive. The others would all be deported and killed. The survivors would later tell of Rösner's efforts to save the Jews. He was arrested by the Gestapo and hung.
They set up a lot of workshops all over the ghetto, all working for the Germans. In the Łódź ghetto, they were also making women's clothes and underwear, and even children's toys.
If they can produce material, goods, things the Germans need, they can generate income, they can buy food. So the ghettos begin to produce.
Anyone who didn't work didn't get any ration coupons. This system excluded the sick and children too young to work. They got no food, and under the circumstances, this was a death sentence.
The ghettos are a temporary measure to hold the Jews until someone has a better idea of what to do, where to send them.
For Germany, it was a holding pen. For the Germans, it was a holding pen. For the Jews, it was life itself. Meaning for the Jews, it was how you're going to live until what they didn't know.
One German practice to terrorize the population was to carry out public hangings. There would be a public execution, and usually they would force people to watch.
Today, the Gestapo have announced that tomorrow at 11 a.m. they will hang Jews. We don't know who these Jews are, nor for what reason they will be hanged. As they were taken to the scaffold, the poor souls raised their eyes to heaven and murmured something. The hangman grabbed them and put the rope around their necks. For a moment, they struggled and kicked, then nothing. Afterwards, the assassins took out flasks of liquor from their pockets, shook hands, shouting, "Morgen weiter! We'll carry on tomorrow." The victims were left hanging until 4 in the afternoon. Then they were cut down and taken to the cemetery. This day shall long remain engraved in our memory.